Live debate. intelligencesquared.com.
Thank you, Monsieur Lévy, for your very interesting analysis. You implicitly made a comparison between the revolutions of 1989 in Central and Eastern Europe and the Arab Spring and Libya. Could you say a little bit more about that comparison? What do you think are the similarities and what do you think are the differences between the revolutions of 1989 and the Arab Spring?
The similarity is that they were, in both cases, war against the impossible. There was a decree in both cases, a decree of the modern providence, which is history, that these two areas were closed to democracy, human rights, whatever. In the 80s, I don't see you well, so maybe you are too young, I don't know. In the 80s or 70s and 80s, it was admitted that the division of Europe was not a geographical one. It was a geographical, it began as a geographical and military division, and it turned out, it transformed itself into an ontological division. There were books of Alexander Zinoviev, for example, the author of the very famous book called Homo Sovieticus, saying that communism had achieved, had succeeded, not in the way which was pursued by the founders of it, but it had built a new man, stranger to the idea of the human rights, indifferent to democracy in the way we conceive it, and so on. This was the common thought. There was the idea that the two parts of Europe lived in a temporality, in a way of thinking, in a civilizational space which was different from those of the West. This was the idea before '89. And nearly nobody could imagine that the two parts of Europe might share the same time, the same time in the sense of Kant, universal time. No, the two Europes were living like in the time, according to Aristotle, who believed that each object had its internal, incorporated, embedded time. There was a time of the Eastern Europe, there was a time of the Western Europe. There was a sort of tourism which developed in the 60s and 70s, which consisted in going in the east of Berlin and discovering a sort of other humanity, other human ecology, which was forever, for the centuries and the centuries different. So was the common sense and the common opinion about the Arab world. There was, for this part of the world too, the common opinion that for religious reasons, for reasons linked to the past, linked to some U-turn which were not taken at the good moment, there were many explanations. But the result was the same. There was an historical, which had become natural antagonism between Islam and democracy. There was an antagonism between Islam and democracy. And you had, till last year, some books, some articles who asked, is Islam compatible with human rights? But the very fact to ask the question implied the reply. The reply was no. No, except if. No, except for a few heroes risking their life, as the dissidents did in the east of Europe. I remember, by the way, it comes now to my souvenir, the first time I spoke here in Intelligence Square, I remember to have called for a chain of solidarity here with the dissidents of Islam, as we did in the 70s with the dissidents of Sovietism. So I saw the situation in this, as exactly similar. A huge granitic ideology, a sort of other way to live one's mankind with some dissidents, some outranking women and men who were, of course, who deserved all our respect, but whose victory was inconceivable. So in this way, yes, the two situations are comparable, and one must admit that neither one event nor the other was predicted by anyone. You cannot, a lot of people now, time passing by, say that in the midst of the 80s, they predicted that communism will, no, really not. And same for the Islamic world. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bernard Henri Lévy, for your talk. A bit romantic, but thank you. But there is a bit of a paradox, I think, in what you've actually said, because whilst I agree with you that you know, there is a great movement of universality of the human spirit in Libya and in Egypt, how do you actually go and explain the position of South Africa, was also emancipated itself from a very harsh regime, but without foreign intervention? And how can you be certain that intervention is the only way for you know, countries and citizens to actually emancipate themselves from dictatorial regime?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? No, my English is even worse when I listen than when I speak.
Okay.
Who is speaking first?
Sure.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I was just thinking.
How I'm sure of what?
No, because you actually said there is a droit d'ingérence,
Yeah.
and Libya has proven that there is a droit d'ingérence. But South Africa all along was actually against this droit d'ingérence. It was more.
Who was against?
South Africa, l'Afrique du Sud. And there is actually, you know, I think there is an history in South Africa of a country and black citizens, you know, actually revolting against a very dictatorial regime. And the emancipation was sustainable. You know, South Africa, you know, has been able to reconcile with its past and to emancipate. And you're actually advocating that the only way in Libya, but it's a question of time, is how long do you give people, you know, in Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia, to actually emancipate themselves? And by actually having this ingérence, do you not actually create more problem in terms of the sustainability of democracy, you know, actually, you know, taking place in these countries? How we are now worried in Egypt with, you know, maybe the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's good or bad, or we are worried in Tunisia about Islam is coming on. Who has the right to decide for these people? Who is actually, you know, the right way to go about their emancipation?
Who has the right to decide? Mankind. If you believe in unicity of mankind, if you don't buy the theory of mankind divided in big holes, W-H-O-L-E-S, big holes, consistent, close to themselves, like big Leibnizian monads without windows and doors. If you don't buy this theory, if you don't buy the theory that inside each hole the problems must be solved and so on, so everybody has a legitimate opinion, a legitimate right to judge about what is happening everywhere. This is what was conceived and conceptualized with the concept of crime against humanity. Crimes against humanity mean that you have some crimes who do not hurt only their actual victims, but who hurt by resonance the whole of humanity. And it means also that the rest of the humanity has the right and the duty to feel concerned and hurt. So this is the general reply. Now, there is a way of implementing that. And of course, the international community cannot act everywhere where there are some crimes which are committed, of course, and alas, because in principle it should. What happens in Syria, the disgusting indifference of the National Security Council is terrible. The way, as I told you, we did not react in the 2 wars of Chechnya, the way in which we embraced the criminal Putin for so many years is really disgusting also. But there is a theoretical right on one side, and there are circumstances which allow to implement the principle. And it is not because we don't implement it everywhere that we should not be happy to implement it when it can be. In other words, during all these months, I heard, but okay, but as an argument against what we were doing in Libya, why don't you do it in Syria? Why did you not do it in Sierra Leone, and so on? And my reply was that I shared absolutely, and more than shared, the sorrow of those who regretted that it was not done in Sierra Leone. I believed with all my will and my heart that Syria deserved exactly the same sort of operation, but this had not to be, could not be a reason not to act where we could act and where we were a concourse of circumstances allowed the international community to act. And I must say also that there is some chains of consequences. And as I told you before, I think that Libya will be a precedent in the history in which we are entering. There will be a Gaddafi jurisprudence. And you will see, again, China, Russia, who believed a few months ago, who believed 1 year ago, that Putin could be interpellated by his own people as he is since a few days. You have a real beginning of earthquake which happens in Russia, and this is linked with what has happening in this part of the world. There is a sort of a continuing spark going on and on, which began in Tunisia, which continued in Libya, and which maybe will reach Russia.
Just on your theory of universal liberty, which you've been talking about. So you mentioned Putin in Russia. Obviously, we've talked about Gaddafi in Libya. In relation to China, which you've just mentioned, do you not think that I mean, so first of all, do you think that we're going to see the rumblings of what we've begun to witness in Russia, in China, in the years to come? And if so, how would you feel about these two factors, which I think should qualify your sort of universal theory? First of all, in China, you have a situation when the ordinary people are getting richer, not poorer, as was in the case in Libya. And secondly, there isn't one dictator, there is a communist party of lots of individuals. So it is harder to fix one's sort of hatred on one individual as you had in the situation with Gaddafi and with Putin. So how do you feel in relation to China that those issues may qualify the theory of universal liberty?
It's hard to reply to that, but what I think is that we are living an extraordinary moment of history. There was a moment in the 60s where there was this wave of decolonization, for example, with Frantz Fanon, with Senghor. There was a wave, a sort of Bickford chord, which was crossing the world and exhorting the peoples not to remain in the chains of empires. There was a time before that where the mood of the moment was the communism, for the best or the worst. And there was a sort of contamination of that. Today, we are living a moment which is for me quite extraordinary. I wish that all my life, where democratic freedoms are seen as an ideal and a reachable ideal nearly everywhere in the world. I do not say that it will be the final word of history. I do not say that some new dictatorships will not succeed and will not come after. I do not say that they will prevail. I do not mean that in China we will not see a new huge Tiananmen, and maybe bigger than the one of 1989. But I say that all over the world, and even in the countries which we believed, and there are tons of books and theories about that, were inventing some sort of new chimeric way of linking the social link. Russia and China, half capitalism, half communism, work but not right, and so on, not all liberty. Even in these places, there is this wind of freedom, this wish for freedom, and this wind of liberty. This is a tendency of today, and nobody will escape that. No place in the world will escape this huge world wind. So what will be the end of the story? I don't know, of course. Putin will not let himself be enthroned like Gaddafi, for sure. But let's see. We might be very surprised by what will happen in Russia. We might discover that Khodorkovsky, for example, saying from the depth of his jail in the desert that the new alternative of the world was corruption and or democracy. Khodorkovsky said that once, that the alternative was no longer socialism and democracy, or communism and liberty, that it was corruption and democracy. Maybe he will be proved to be right. Maybe he will be proved to be right when he said that the new oil tsarism of Russia did not strangle completely the wish of freedom of the Russia of Pushkin. When he said that Tolstoy did not completely destroy and make forget Turgenev, he said all of that from the depth of his jail. Maybe he will be proven to be right. So what I say is that the mood of the time, le fond de l'air. There was a movie of Chris Marker in the 60s called Le fond de l'air est rouge. The depth of the air is red. Today it is not red, it is, I don't know, orange, like in Ukraine, green, like in Libya, white, like in Russia. I don't know. But there is a fond de l'air which is really changing. And we are witnesses of that. This is a great responsibility, and this is also a great chance. Okay? It's not me.
Bonsoir. If it was correct to intervene in Libya to overthrow one dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, why was it wrong to intervene in Iraq to overthrow another dictator, Saddam Hussein, a war which in the past you described as detestable? Surely if one was justifiable and legitimate, then so was the other. And I expect that will be a lengthy answer. So just quickly, do you expect President Barack Obama to be re-elected next year?
He might be re-elected, yes. What is the difference between Libya and Iraq? Two main differences. First one, truth and lies. Truth and lies. And in the time in which we are entering, when moral standards and moral values take a new role, the difference is not nothing. The Iraqi war was based upon lies. The Libyan war was based upon a sort of truth. Nothing was disguised. No. There was no hidden interest. There was no hidden plot. There was no cosmetic arrangements. In Iraq, you had all this stuff about the weapons of mass destruction and so on, which in the egg, from the beginning, spoiled the story. The other difference, which is very important, and which is maybe essential, is that there is a right and a duty to intervene, always, but much more, and with much more chance of succeeding, when you come to support, first, somebody who asks for it, and second, somebody who not only asking, but is already fighting. In Libya, we supported a real uprising of a whole people who, in its majority at least, was expressing the wish of getting rid of Gaddafi. In Iraq, the democracy was supposed to be parachuté, to come by air, without any force, genuine and rooted on the ground. The Americans had to build a sort of bouffon party and organization and people. We will not name them, it's unuseful, in order to justify the intervention. And this makes a very big difference. To come to support a people already uprising, or to come to impose a democracy which has, for the moment, at this point, no real spokesman in the country, it makes the whole difference between the two. Number three, the war in Iraq had not only boots on the ground, but there was a plan of occupation. And in fact, till now, till this time, there have been some occupation forces. The great wisdom of Cameron and Sarkozy this time was to decide that there will not be one foot of one regular soldier on the ground of Libya. And the last difference between Libya and Iraq, there is another one. The decision to act in Iraq was taken against the international community expressed by the United Nations. Again, the wisdom, and not only the wisdom, but the energy of this time Sarkozy, more than anyone else, made that this action was endorsed by an international mandate, which made it not only morally justified, but juridically, in terms of rights, juridically right and morally justified. So you have at least 4 reasons which make the difference between the war in Iraq and the war in Libya. Madame.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lévy. You said that this Libya war defeated the idea of clash of civilizations. I would like to ask you, do you think that Libyan intervention also transformed the idea of collective security through the United Nations compared to Kosovo war, for example?
Do I think, I'm sorry, if...
Do you think that Libya intervention changed the idea of the United Nations? Do you think that these military alliances replaced the idea of the UN?
I think that United Nations dishonored itself since its creation, step by step. All the great rendezvous of United Nations were missed. United Nations dishonored itself in Sudan and Darfur, in Bosnia, in Timor, Eastern Timor, dishonored itself everywhere in the world. For the first time, there was a decent, brave decision taken by international nations and implemented by a force ad hoc. So it is as if, at the last minute before the gong, United Nations saved itself. These United Nations who had a committee for human rights, which president was Gaddafi, which had a committee for equality between the sex, which president was the representative of Ahmadinejad. United Nations was a joke, was a piece of fluff, was a stock of fluff, a laughing stock. During decades, it was a pity, it was a shame. United Nations was useless, or when it serves to something, it was for the worst. For the first time, they took a courageous decision. No veto, a few abstentions, and the decision to intervene. Last question. Yeah.
Thank you. do you think the intervention in Libya would have happened if Sarkozy and Cameron were men of the left? And what future do you see for the political left?
What future I see for?
For the political left.
I don't know if I think that it would probably. I don't want to, as I said today in another assembly. I'm not a fan of neither Sarkozy nor Cameron. Frankly, not a fan. But it could not have happened with anybody else. It's a fact, c'est comme ça. Mitterrand, François Mitterrand, for whom I had a huge admiration, to whom I came speaking in the same way as I did with Sarkozy. I came to Mitterrand 20 years ago, 18 years ago, at the beginning of the war in Bosnia. I tried to attract, to grasp his attention as I did with Sarkozy. I thought I succeeded. I was sure at the moment when he made his famous trip to Sarajevo that he heard. And the reality is that he misunderstood, to say the least, or maybe he cheated, to say the worst. And he bears a huge responsibility in the fact that the war in Bosnia lasted so long. So Sarkozy did what Mitterrand did not do. Cameron did what Blair did not do, neither in Darfur nor I don't know where. So these two guys did that. I don't know why. I don't know why. Each of them has probably some personal reasons to have done it. There was a brotherhood between the two, in spite of the recent incidents, in spite of the conclusion which could be too quickly drawn from the recent veto in Europe and so on, there was a real brotherhood between the two men, a common decision-making, the feeling to continue for their generation a very old story of their grandfathers, free French, and free French, and free England were already associated in another battle where our freedom was directly involved. And they had both of them, I think, and I know, for one of them at least. They had the conviction to continue this great history and to put their feet in these glorious footsteps. So, what makes two leaders thinking like that? What makes them faithful to their memory and free of it at the same time? What makes that history is a source of wealth, mental health, and not of a burden, paralyzing, a burden which paralyzes, which stops you? There has been a really mysterious chemistry in this moment, in the relationship between our two countries, and in the minds of these two leaders. Maybe they will not do anything else. Maybe Mr. Cameron will not be Prime Minister in a few weeks if his Vice Prime Minister continues in the same mood. Maybe Sarkozy will not be re-elected in a few months. But they will have done this. And they will have done it together. And this is really something. Okay? I thank you very much.